So really my goal today is to talk a little bit about what I've been working on for the last year or so in this world of gamification. Sort of outline some stuff about gamification as you may know it, where I'm pushing gamification and sort of future directions. So a little bit about what got me to this point. So from 2008 until 2011, I ran the Library Game Lab of Syracuse. And during that time, I was trying to really understand how libraries were using gaming. I did some large-scale census-type surveys where we got a good understanding that about 70% of libraries were using gaming in some way, and tried to understand how libraries were using it to build communities. And also another piece that I worked on during this time, which should be coming out soon in Library Quarterly, traces gaming in libraries back to the mid-1800s and actually traces it forward to look at all the different ways gaming has actually been involved in libraries. My big message out of this was that gaming is nothing new. We've had games in libraries for a long time. And when I talk about games, I'm talking about all sorts of games. Any form of play with goals and structure, that's a game. So it's not just games that look on a screen, but there's games in the world everywhere around us. And that brings into play a lot of what's going on with gamification. But as Marie mentioned, last year I was here at MIT. I did a sabbatical there. I was actually working for 3 different programs during that time. So I was a visiting professor in comparative media studies. My primary home during that time was at the Gambit Game Lab, where I was a visiting scholar, which has now become the MIT Game Lab. So they were funded by the government of Singapore to help help Singaporean students learn game design along with MIT students. And in this lab, the way they worked is they would work with faculty to identify interesting projects and then create games to help other people understand faculty research. So for example, one of the games that was made when I was there was a driving game where you had one of the things you could control was the constant of relativity. And so as you drove and changed what the relativity constant was, you would see the world change in different ways. And by doing this, you get a better understanding of what relativity really meant. Yeah, I was at MIT. And then I worked with the Education Arcade. And so this is a group actually that's been around for about 30 years. I don't know if you've heard of Logo. That actually, this is where Logo began, was this group. And they're still going along. They're mainly focused in games in schools. I'm still partnered with the Education Arcade on an IMLS grant where we created an alternate reality game toolkit for libraries. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But really one of the most influential part of my sabbatical is I was also living in the undergraduate dorms. I lived in Simmons Hall. I was a visiting scholar there, and what they had, so I ended up having 4 titles while there. What they had are 4 resident scholars in the dorms, and we worked with the undergrads, we ate with the undergrads, we put on programs for them, and that really, this really fueled my engagement with the undergrad world. I'd really, for the last 12 years at Syracuse, I've been really focused more on the graduate program, but coming here and working more with undergrads got me inspired to go back home and begin to really engage more with our undergrad space. And that's sort of the transitions I'm doing right now. I'm moving out of our graduate library programs and shifting more into some of our undergrad programs and the honors program and things like that at Syracuse. So it was an interesting time for me, but one of the things that it helped me realize as I engaged in all these different areas is what made MIT interesting and special was that they embodied the concept of play. They supported play, they created playful spaces. When you'd walk around campus, you would see playful things, and that concept of play stuck with me. And so when I came back home, I changed my lab. Now my lab is now called Because Play Matters. And so during that time I was focusing, I knew I wanted to move out of gaming in libraries, but I didn't know what direction. So my work with the Gambit Lab was more looking at sort of commercial game creation and things like that. My work with the Education Arcade was more focused in games in K through 12. But what I realized is a place that fits nicely with my background is actually working in informal learning settings. And the area that I'm creating is actually creating transformative games, which is Jesse Schell's term. Instead of calling them serious games, which sounds awful, games for change, which is a little better. But I really like the concept of transformative games, games designed to change the player. That's why we're making the games, because they are designed to be a transformative experience. And I'm focusing on informal learning settings, because right now, as I found with my work with the Education Arcade, it's very difficult to get things into the classroom because of our heavy test-based environments. Teachers are not as willing to experiment in their classroom spaces. But you can experiment in after-school programs, in these community-based programs, and that's really a lot of my focus. The other aha I had at my MIT time was the way they did their student groups there. There are about 450 student groups, but they're not really student groups. They're groups that happen to have students in them. Actually, most people in these groups were alumni, were members of the community, were faculty, and some students. I participated in a number of these different groups while I was there. And it was a cool space because you got to intersect way outside of the walls of MIT. So I decided to start something like that at Syracuse. So in August, I started the Game Designers Guild as a community-based outreach arm of my lab. And what we do in this guild, we meet once a month on a Friday night at night, so it's easy to park, and it's open to anyone that wants to come. So we have kids coming, we have members of the community, we have people coming up from Cornell, from Morrisville, from other local schools. And during these meetings, what we do is we invite a member of the community who has a need for a game to come and pitch their need. We then, as a group, brainstorm that. We then create a work team of people who want to make a prototype for that community group. We work to create the prototype, and then once it's done, if the group likes it, we write a grant with that community group to actually fund the creation of the game. So last semester, we made a game for a large military national park, Fort Stanwix, which was in a place of a very important battle. And we created a game for them called Stories from Stanwix. And it's a sort of a choose-your-own-adventure digital game that helps you understand the lives of the people who were affected by this military fort coming into a space. The combats are really on the side. And when they first pitched it to us, they said, we want some sort of digital game to help people understand what's going on at Stanwix. And we said, oh, well, we could do a big first-person shooter and all that. It's like, well, no. Actually, if you go to the place and you go to the way these battlegrounds are trying to couch themselves, they're really trying to get the stories across. So we created a game where you take on the role of a native, you take on the role of a citizen who lives in the area, and you make decisions while the battle's going around you to really understand the impact this had. We're working with the Science Museum in the area, and so next month, or July, 3 months from now, we're going to be doing a game jam for 7th and 8th graders in the Science Museum, where they're going to come in for the day. We're going to let them find an exhibit they like. They're going to set up and make games to go along with the exhibit. They're going to be partnered with one of us from the guild. They're going to be partnered with a local scientist. So they're going to be exploring science careers. They're going to be exploring game design, and the museum's going to get a lot of ideas of different sorts of game-based exhibits they could create. So this has really taken off. This is actually because it's way outside of the iSchool. In fact, I've got a faculty affiliates network that I've made for my lab. We've got people from Newhouse, from education, from English, from visual and performing arts, and computer science, who are all a part of this program. And so I'm really trying to grow this thing way outside of one school, because there isn't a program about gaming at Syracuse right now. And so I don't want it to get stuck in one school. I want to try and spread the wealth, if you will, and there's a lot of people interested in gaming. So that's what I've created so far. But my research is actually about gamification, what I've been looking at for the last year. So during this talk today, I'm going to talk about what gamification is. I'm going to talk about reward-based gamification. I'm going to talk about meaningful gamification, and then talk a little bit about some ideas for long-term change, where this comes into play. So gamification, there's a number of definitions. This is the one that I like to use. I tend to like simpler definitions for things because it allows you to cast a bigger net. The use of game design elements in non-game contexts. So the idea is you're taking something from game design out there and you're applying it as a layer to something in the real world. In fact, that's the name of my class that I teach on this topic, called Adding Game Layers to the Real World, which looks at gamification and also augmented reality as different ways of layering game elements onto the real world. Now, there's some other definitions that are out there. Where gamification that some people focus on, the connection it makes to audiences, that it reaches out, and the idea is to engage audiences in a non-gaming environment. Other definitions talk about to engage users and to solve problems, but I really like this straightforward use of game design elements in non-game contexts. So that's the definition we're going to have moving forward a bit. I want to make sure you understand it's different from game-based learning. So there's a lot of confusion between gamification and game-based learning. Where in the World of Carmen Sandiego was the last popular recreational game with good educational content, made many, many years ago. But when you're playing this game, you're not actually hunting Carmen Sandiego. You're doing a simulation of a hunt of Carmen Sandiego. And in game-based learning, the idea is that you're playing within this closed world and exploring topics within the closed world, as compared to gamification, which is an exploration of something in the real world through game-based layers. Some people are using things like recreational games like Civilization in order to teach concepts of history and concepts of economics. This is also a form of game-based learning. It's not gamification. So with game-based learning, the idea, and Jane McGonigal doesn't like to use the word gamification. She uses gameful design, gameful thinking. We're seeing some people use that term. But So with gamification, you're focused on game elements. That's a layer on the real world as compared to game-based learning, which you're simulating activity. You can still have a gamification layer in game-based learning. You can have people learning through the game, and then there's a gamification layer on top of it. But what we're going to focus on today is really this concept of gamification and not game-based learning. Now, when I talk about game design elements, we should probably talk about what a game is. This is the definition I like to use of what a game is. Again, I like the simpler definition. A game is a form of play with goals and structure. It's very simple, but it's open-ended and really opens up the world of games out there. So there's three things that we're going to be talking about: play, goals, and structure. These are the things that make up a game. And we'll be coming back to this a little bit later. Most gamification, the idea is you're taking something in the real world and you're adding goals. You're adding some sort of goals on top of it. Bernard Suits talks about in his book that playing a game, you play a game because you want to take on unnecessary obstacles. That's why we seek out games to play, because we need more obstacles in our life. We don't have enough. So the idea of gamification is you're adding unnecessary obstacles on top of something in the real world with the hope of engaging people in the real world by having them engage with these extra obstacles. And you need a structure to facilitate that pursuit. But a lot of it comes down to, at this point, gamification offering rewards. Getting people to engage with something by giving them rewards. That's what much of the gamification that you see right now is all about. I'll talk a little bit more about this structure. So the typical gamification model, you take something in the real world, you add a gamey goal on top of it, you develop a structure to support that goal, and then you add a reward level on top of it. And that's what we see right now, is this model of gamification. I'll talk about one example that I'll bring up later, Zamzy. Zamzy is if you know there's something called a Fitbit or like the Nike Fuel Band. This is a basic pedometer. The idea is that you give it to kids. Kids keep it on their belts. When they run around, as they run around, they accumulate points, and as they get the points, they plug it back in, and then Zamzy helps them level up and then helps them earn rewards. The rewards have been previously purchased by parents. So parents go to Zamzy and give Zamzy money to buy rewards, and then Zamzy facilitates the distribution of the rewards by getting the kids to move around. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but I just wanted to give you that as an idea of this reward-based gamification layer on getting kids engaged. And they report, yes, kids do 75% more activity than they did before when they use this, and we'll come back to this, but I wanted to at least give you a basic idea. Now, gamification is not something new. We have had things that entice us to engage with the real world for a while. And when I give this talk to an audience of undergrads, I show this and it's, blank stares. If you still have these, by the way, you can still cash them in. What? Online, the S&H, the green stamps, it's now called green points. You can send these in. One stamp is worth 1 point in the program. And it's something like for 25,000 stamps, you can get $25. But if you have these upstairs, you can still cash in green. So for those of you that don't know what these are, what you would do is when you check out something at a register, they would have a machine, they would crank the machine and stamps would come out and you get stamps for the money that you spent. You then collect the stamps in books, you turn in those books, and you get rewards for it. So we've had these levels going on for some time. Most of us probably have keychains and wallets that are filled with these things, where we have these point-based systems that are sitting on top of the real world. And these elements of gamification is something that we've been engaged with for some time. We've got airline miles and the airline systems that go on that entice you to fly with a certain airline. I know many of us who travel a lot, we only want to fly on one airline because we want to make sure and collect the miles, and because they give us rewards, they give us free bags, they let us get comfortable seats, all that good stuff. But casinos and hotels, Holiday Inn was actually the first hotel to add a reward-based system on top of their staying program. So all of these is showing that this is not new. We've been at this for some time. The Monopoly game, actually, McDonald's Monopoly is one of their most popular promotions, and it's taking basic concepts of Monopoly, of set collection, and as you collect these sets, you can turn them in for prizes. However, badges have also been around for some time, and in fact, the military have used badges as a way to get people engaged in things in the real world in different ways. In fact, one of our oldest gamification scholars, Napoleon, talked about how a soldier will fight long and hard for a bit of colored ribbon. We've been using these sorts of things to motivate people for a very long time. So I'm going to talk about a form of gamification which I have called BLAP gamification. because it engages with badges, with levels or leaderboards, with achievements and points. I'm going to present this first. So this is BLAP gamification. I needed a name for this. And one of the reasons I call it BLAP is because you can take any real world setting, make up something out of this, drop it on the real world setting, it lands with a BLAP, and there you have gamification. So let's talk about how we get to there. First we talk about points. Now, when you look at this slide, you see a bunch of balls. And you probably have a feeling immediately of what you're going to do with each one of those balls. You know, if you look at this ball, you know what you're supposed to do with it. You're not supposed to carry it and run around. You're not supposed to kick it. You're supposed to throw it towards a hoop or pass it to another player. As compared to this ball, it's also a ball. It's round. But this ball brings about very different feelings. And this ball has totally, every one of these balls, or funny shaped balls, have different ways that you instinctually know, here's how I engage with that ball. And that's because game designers have used the concept of points to train us how to use these things. They have used points to tell us what is good and what is bad. What is the right way to handle a specific ball, and what is a way that you'll be punished if you handle a specific ball. So the idea of points in game design, points are really the game designer's way of controlling behavior and getting players to act in certain ways. Today, the other way that game designers control behavior is through time. Because it used to be that you would play a video game and you'd have 3 lives and you'd try and fail, so you could be rewarded by points and you'd punished by failing and losing a life. But today's video games don't have lives. Instead, they allow you to redo something as many times as you want, but it costs you time. And the better you are at a game, the less time it takes you to move on through the game. So that's our main path of reward is through points, and our punishment through time for game designers to get us to change our behavior and engage with the game. So the interesting thing is when you run into a game and you don't like that game, many times it's because the thing the game designer rewards is not the form of play you want to do. When you take a ball, you want to do something with the ball, and if it's not rewarded by points, you're then frustrated. Do I change my behavior to do what the game designer wants me to do, or do I not worry about points and just have fun and just play? And that puts a person in this point of conflict. And so a good game for someone is where their desire of play matches up with what the game designer wishes to reward. But the idea in gamification is that in order to create a points-based system, first you identify the desired behaviors. What do you want someone to do? You then connect those behaviors with points. You give them points when they do something. Many of today's gamification systems don't have penalties. They just have rewards. So they connect the behavior with points. You reward the points with incentives. So you try to find some incentives that you can reward points from. And then if you ask most people, then you profit. Hooray! Because this sort of gamification, actually it works. It's effective. It brings people in the short term. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's kind of like this thing. So B.F. Skinner did a lot of research on animals and got mice to be able to press buttons to be able to get rewards. And he found there were different ways of doing this, and many gamification structures are built exactly off of the models and the lessons that we learned by making these Skinner boxes. Getting people to engage in some silly activity in order to score points. This is me and Jenny Levine at ALA. This was actually the moment where I started my library game lab when I saw this Dance Dance Revolution game. And so unlike pushing a pellet, I was jumping up and down on pads, but as I did it, I was scoring points. So if you take this sort of picture of a Skinner box and you replace that Skinner box with a video game controller, and you think about the behaviors that game designers are teaching, you can get people to do really silly things. And you can also get people to spend a heck of a lot of money. Slot machines are based off of the concepts that we learned from these Skinner boxes. That this operant conditioning, getting people to do a behavior without a reward, is what Skinner learned. And he learned that if you give people random amounts of rewards at random times, that is the most effective way to get them to continue doing something without a reward. That's how slot machines work. And that's how some gamification systems work. To get you to, because if you give a reward every time, if I gave you $1 every time I asked you to open the door for me, well then you would get into a pattern. If I stopped giving you dollars, you would stop opening the door for me. But if every once in a while, I would give you a $20 tip, but then many times I'd give you nothing, you'd be a lot more likely to open the door hoping to get that tip. And so slot machines work that way, some gamification systems work that way. I tried some of this in the classes I taught last semester. That didn't work out so well. I actually just released an article this morning, a preprint of a presentation I'm giving next month on gamification for classroom management, where I tried a lot of these sort of manipulative techniques in my classrooms to explore what works and what doesn't work in these spaces. So I'll point you to the URL later if you want to see that article and see what I learned and what worked and what failed. Oops. There we go. So we talked about points, now let's talk about levels. Levels are a way of taking points and breaking them down. This was actually the quest for Mount Gamification. This was the class, one of the classes I taught last semester. And students started with 0 points. Everything they did in the class earned them points. As they earned points, they went up in levels. And as they reached certain levels on the mountain, then their elevation level would change, and that's how they would reach an A. So the students had a large pile of things they could take on. They choose what to take on. As they took on more stuff, they'd go up. One reason why this failed is because halfway through the semester, students want to know, well, what's my grade? Well, your grade's an F. But I've done really well on my assignments. Yeah, but you're still an F. And the university contacts me, hey, you have these students, we need to know what their grade is. It's an F. So this didn't work so well. In fact, I found students were so confused, non-gamers were frustrated by this system because they couldn't conceptualize this, and so I flipped it back around to our standard, you have 100 and you lose points from their system. It was very easy to do because this is actually just a superficial layer on our traditional points-based system. It really doesn't change much. And I found the frustration wasn't worth it. This is one of the pieces I talk about in the article that I just mentioned. But levels also, if you don't know a lot about the video game world, if you talk about levels, it can be confusing. This is from Angry Birds, and so what happens in this game is each level is a different challenge. Each level is a self-contained challenge. So one of the frustrations, if I talk about levels, is you might confuse the level that a player has because they're indicating how good they are as compared to the level of the game, which is indicating their difficulty. The usefulness of those two things, it allows us to deal with something called flow. So Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, so what he did is created this concept of flow, and the idea is that when you create something, that as a person's skill gets better, the challenge should get more difficult. If the person's skill gets better and the challenge does not get more difficult, then it's boring. If the challenge is too hard and the person's skill can't reach it, it creates anxiety. But when you're ramping up their challenge and their skill set together, that creates a state of flow where you're really engaged with what's going on. This is a good lesson for us as educators. That when we create a class, we should think about this. How do we create this structure of flow so that we have easy assignments at the beginning, challenging assignments at the end, and you want to keep students in this channel? The ideas of levels versus levels actually graphs nicely onto this. A level that a player has goes up as the player performs better in the game. The level that the game has gets more challenging as the game gets more difficult. And you map those two together, and that helps you keep someone in that state of flow. There's another concept of leaderboards. So leaderboards are a way of, while levels are your performance against the game, leaderboards is your performance against other people. So leaderboards are a way of ranking yourself against other people. This is actually a screenshot from something I'll talk about later called Orange Tree. Orange Tree is a gamification system for libraries. So these are library visitors, and how many points they've earned by doing library activities, how many visits they've had to the library, and how many achievements they've earned. Anyone can see this. We'll talk a little bit about, I'll show you a few more screenshots later on of this and some of the concerns I have with patron privacy when you have these sort of public leaderboards about who's doing better. I tried leaderboards in my class, by the way, and what I found is that a few students really got into it, and the rest of the students hit a point very quickly where they felt there was no way they could catch up, and they gave up. And again, I talk about that in my article, but I learned that leaderboards are great for a few, but very demoralizing for everyone in the bottom of the pack. Oh. There we go. So this was actually over 6 weeks of the class. So this represents a student's performance and the grades that they were able to earn. Each week of the class, they had a massive pile of things they could do, much more than any one person actually could do. And so some people got really competitive and tried to do everything they could. And a few people tried to stay with them and then stop doing anything. Most of the class didn't do anything. As you see, most of the class just stayed right down here. And this is where I stopped it. And then we had big debriefs and talk about what happened. And these students were saying, there was no way I could catch up. I just stopped trying. I didn't know what I was going to do. They were incredibly frustrated. The way this class worked, this was my gamification class I taught last year. So the first 6 weeks were designed as a complete manipulative gamification system because I wanted them to experience it. So then we could talk about how it affected them. Because then when they came back to class, they got to redesign the class for their last month of class. So the students actually created what they were going to do using meaningful gamification concepts. But that was my experiment with leaderboards and how that didn't work. Sure.
All those students are gamers?
No.
It's interested in gamification?
Right. It was an elective class.
Okay.
I had a mix of students in our library program. Some of our undergrads were in it. There were a few people from some of the other schools in education and things like that. This class is called Meaningful Gamification. But
who is that student?
I can't tell you that. It is Dot. I don't, actually the students all had, they were, while they were listed by names,
I'm not student.
yes, this was actually a bard. This was a bard, a musician, because the students got to create alternate characters that they were on the quest for meaningful gamification. And so the leaderboards were presented under their alter egos so that there was not a student privacy issue. Because I wanted the leaderboard effect, but I didn't want everyone to know who everyone else was. So this was the bard in the party. He would sing songs as they went on the quest for meaningful gamification. He did not want to change the world. In fact, we allowed the class to vote. I did a Matrix-style video that I sent out to the class where I appeared and said, oh, things are going awful. You've got to choose. Choose the red die, and all of this will go away, and I don't know what will happen. Choose the blue die, and I'll disappear, and you'll wake up tomorrow and think whatever you want to think. You have 1 day to vote. And all the students voted whether they wanted the class to change or stay the same. And this guy up top was the only one that voted to keep the class the same. So in the storyline of the course, he continued alone on the quest to mount gamification and was never heard from again.
I just have a question.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, in the most rudimentary games, there are these ways that you can then catch up, like chutes and ladders. You hit a ladder, you can climb up. Or I was thinking Candyland. There's one square you start to double points or whatever. And I was just wondering if in these kinds of things where you have the leaderboards, if there are ways to sort of keep that encouragement going through some, like, okay, so if you do extra credit or whatever it is, you can catch up to some of the other people who might be so far ahead.
So the challenge is, how do you do that in a way that is fair to the people that are also doing all that extra credit? In this course, they were offered bucket loads of opportunity, and they could do many more things, and everything had points. So this person actually was doing pretty much everything he could.
Okay.
So the question is then, how do you offer something to them that this person also doesn't get access to make that fair? And then they actually have that in video games, in racing video games. They have what's called the rubber band effect. And the idea of many racing video games, when you're racing and you're playing and you're frustrated and you're way in the back, the game gives you advantages to help you jump to the front. Some of the games do it very directly through power-ups that you only get if you're in the back that jump you to the front. Other games do it a little bit more subtly. But if you're in the front, you're not getting very strong power-ups. So in the video game world, that's how they deal with that, because this is kind of like a racing game. If you're playing a racing game, a solo racing game, and you're back here, it does get very frustrating as a player. So some of those games do game mechanisms. In the classroom space, it can be a little bit more frustrating to put that into play. So you've got to think about how to, and actually the way that I did it. So how did I end this fairly? So we had the students come up with syllabi, and the best idea came from one group that said, each student gets to make their own learning contract. And they reflect upon, here's what I've done so far in the class. Here's the grade I want. Here's what I'm willing to do in this month of class to get that grade. So these people didn't have to do much at all in the last month of class. These people knew they had to work hard. They were doing a big assignment every week, but they were given that opportunity. So that's how I did it in that class, is I said, what do you want grade-wise? And then I negotiated with each student, what do you want to do to reach that? And every student but one fulfilled their entire contract that they put together. And most of them did a lot more than I would have assigned, actually. So that was actually one of the takeaways from that class, is that structure worked well.
So what you did was you took a situation where people competed against each other, and then you allowed them to compete against a goal they articulated.
Right.
So, as you know, I don't know much about games, but if I teach a multivariate course to the doctoral students, they don't know what they don't know at the start of it. They don't know, they just don't understand all that they have to learn. It's a complicated course. So they wouldn't even know how to do the contract. But I like the idea that they're not competing with each other, that they're competing with themselves.
Mm-hmm. And that shifted. The contract moment didn't come until it was about, they had 3 weeks to make these syllabi, so it was about a little over halfway when they made the contract for the last part of the class. So by that time, they had a pretty good idea of what they've done and what was going on. I felt everything was established to be able to make this work out. But yeah, if I had done the beginning, it would have not have worked as well.
Each person comes in at a different level, and then they contract to come up to a higher level.
Mm-hmm.
So the people that come in high have to get even higher. That's the straight line guy, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I would work with each student to say, all right, what do you want grade-wise? And let's figure out what's fair based on what you've done now and what you need to still do to reach that point.
Very nice.
So I know you're sort of moving in this direction.
Right.
I wonder, so obviously the core content of the class is gamification.
Mm-hmm.
And was there a way for you to look at, so obviously you're moving into the sort of transformative play
Right.
area in your talk, I think. And so what I'm wondering is whether there's a way for you to identify how connected the students were or motivated the students were by the core content, or what purpose they may have been taking the class for as their driver for engagement, and whether you may have seen that having an influence on those lives.
So in this class, because it was an elective,
Yeah.
most of the students did have an interest in taking this class. In fact, a number of the students down here, when I did sort of the post interviews, indicated they were very frustrated because they knew I was so several said, I thought you were a good teacher and I really wanted to learn this stuff, yet you put us in this system and I was so frustrated. I also did gamification in my required information presentation class. And so in that, it's a required public speaking class, and I also talk about that in the article and what worked and what failed.
What's interesting, well, what's wonderful about it is that you're giving students an actual experience to think about what effect gamification has
Right.
on their future students or on whatever context they may in the future be applying it.
I wanted a baseline that we could talk about for the rest of the class to make what will be in the second half of this talk, the meaningful part of it, much more meaningful if they had actually been manipulated first by a system, and then we could really take it apart and say, all right, let's talk about the other part of this.
So I'm wondering how you would handle it in a classroom situation where you had a contract, they're setting their own goals. So you see the students that are down at the
Mhm.
bottom, they're down there for whatever reason, but if suppose they contract at a C level,
Mm-hmm.
what do you do about that? Is C okay to be striving for the whole class?
One of the things, and
Semester?
I'll talk a little bit later about some of the theories that support this. And yes, if that's what the student says, that's actually how these systems work, is if a student says, I'm going to be happy getting a C, then I say, okay, here is the workload you need to take on to get a C. And that's the way I want to set up that opportunity for the students. If they come in and that's their goal, okay, I will let them do that. Now, my hope would be as we got into it, they might choose to rework that contract. But the reality is, and I find this, it's this question of, I'll talk a little bit later about rewards and grades and why grades have ruined our education system because people are happy to come in and take the C. And I'll talk about one method I use to get around that a little bit later. Yeah.
How do you get around that?
Yeah.
To motivate them to strive for?
Yeah, so one of the things I'm doing this semester is different. And I'll talk about that in a little bit.
Thanks. Okay, so you mentioned that you had a number of different assignments that were options for the students to complete, and the high achieving BARD completed them all. Did you have the option where if you complete this assignment, it unlocks another assignment that you can take on and you start going on a particular track? Or was it, you have to complete this array of assignments, you can complete them in any order?
This was all options.
Okay.
So there were some things that were mandatory. There were occasional things to unlock the next part of the story, they had to complete the mandatory aspects. And then there were piles of optional things that they could choose from.
I was thinking along the lines of what Marie was asking you about, to catch up.
Mhm.
Or if someone went on a particular track and unlocked a particular assignment and then kept moving on along that track, that they could potentially earn more points than if they had selected a different track.
And that's what it turned into, basically, with the negotiated contracts. Is some students did then, they all made their own tracks from that point on. So, also talk a little bit about achievements. So achievements are ways of getting people to engage with a game that is maybe counter from how they earn points. It's a way to create a game space where people will do different things, where people will take on different challenges, where people, in this case, this is actually people doing, these are achievements that are available for people doing support in a tech environment. And so here we have someone responding to 100 support cases in the same day. Here we have an achievement for respond to a support case using a macro, respond to support cases using the bulk editor. These are not things that points are necessarily given for, but they're a way to explore a space that are different, that are outside the norm. I actually offered achievement in my gamification class that they didn't know about. It was the Evil Overlord achievement. And so when someone created a particularly manipulative gamification system as an assignment, they were awarded this Evil Overlord achievement. They didn't know they were going for it, and once they knew it was out there, then they began really becoming evil. And that was kind of what I wanted them to do, was to take these steps down the dark path with me, so then I could say, look, okay, look what this has done to you, now let's reflect and move on.
So was that the case with all of the achievements, was that they didn't know that they would potentially earn the badge
Right.
until after they had done
And they
it?
didn't know, there were some, I gave some optional assignments with no reward listed, some gave no reward, some were achievements that turned into badges, and some gave points. And so that's that slot machine effect. They don't know what they're doing, so they choose things to take on, and some gave them rewards and some had fixed rewards, but that was my experimentation. I found those didn't work too well. Actually, students really weren't willing to go into an unknown reward-based, because we've ruined learning over the last 20 years, the first 20 years of people's lives, by getting them to do things just for grades. But that's, again, I'll get to that problem of using grades as rewards. So achievements are ways of getting people to explore a space outside of points. It's when you want to get something to do someone to do something that's not necessarily point-based, but to try some different things. And they can be expected or unexpected. And then that leads into badges. So badges, the big thing about badges is they're designed for public view. A badge is designed by something you're going to wear in public that helps you align in some way. It may be based upon an achievement, it may be based upon hitting certain points in the gamification system, but they create goals for people to strive for. Badges can also help you identify with other people that are like you. So you see badges and you see someone's got a badge and you might say, hey, I'm kind of like that person because we're wearing a similar badge. Mozilla has created this open badges framework, which is available for you to create a way of giving out badges, and this framework will facilitate that. So you've got this badge backpack, which shows you badges you've gotten from a lot of different systems. So badges are ways of doing a public display of everything I've talked about so far. And so they can be useful. Badges have some uses. One of the uses is for recognizing informal learning. Recognizing pieces of learning that aren't necessarily for a grade, aren't necessarily in a class for points, but they recognize, hey, you understand AV. You speak Spanish, things like that. There was an interesting exploration that they did. I don't remember which metro area it was in, but as kids got to a certain point in Spanish, they were given a badge that said, I speak Spanish, and they were encouraged to wear this badge as they were out in public, to engage with people out in the public and help them. And so it was a way of identifying a skill that they had. So badges are good for handling new skills. They allow multiple paths to learning. You say, I want to go for this goal. Here's different paths to get there. They can create community and reputation. And this is really where a lot of people are right now. They've kind of hit badges. As they say, badges are wonderful. This is where we are. And I'm going to say there's more. There's more to go, and that's the next part of this. So Barbara Kwasnick, who so many of you know, actually taught me this, that there's nothing as practical as a good theory. So let's take a moment to talk a little bit about the theory that's really behind where I'm going here, and that's self-determination theory by DC and Ryan. And the idea here is that people have reasons they do things that are intrinsic, and they have reasons they do things that are extrinsic. And these different reasons, people, they're active and evolving, and the social context in which they get these rewards can nurture someone or harm someone. But there's three things at the core of self-determination theory: autonomy, that you need to have choice in your life; competence, you need to feel like you can master things in your life; and relatedness, that you feel like what you're doing is related to the world around you. These things are at the core of where I'm heading next, is how do we create gamification systems that help with this? And we can use some of the tools I just talked about. We don't have to leave that all behind, but we use those tools in a different context. We think about these things. Another part of their theory, cognitive evaluation theory, talks about how do rewards affect your intrinsic motivation. If you want to do something, how do rewards affect that? And what they found is that the type of the external reward makes a difference. That if rewards are given as information, they were not as harmful to your intrinsic motivation as though if the rewards were given as a controlling reward. That if the reward was intangible, it was not as harmful as a tangible reward. That if the reward was unexpected, it was not as harmful as an expected reward. Is it information along the way that pops up? Oh, that's a surprise. Or is it a goal you're going for? And so is it based on a reward based on completion is more harmful to your intrinsic motivation than an reward that is feedback for your competence. So if we're using these rewards, we want to think about how do we use them more in this way and less in this way. How do we create systems that do that? But they also talked about that the quality of the motivation matters. And so our mental wellness comes from satisfying these intrinsic goals. Why bother with intrinsic goals? Well, because we feel better about life. We don't have mental well-being comes from following these extrinsic goals. And so that's why this push is to try and help people think about what they're doing and why they're doing it and internalize these concepts. This sentence in this book, which is seen as kind of the core book of gamification, Gamification by Design and O'Reilly, when I read this sentence, my blood ran cold and I said, I have got to do something about this. This was the point where I began this whole work. This sentence: once you start giving someone a reward, you have to keep her in that reward loop forever. And I said, wow, I need to tell the libraries about this. I need to help people be aware that this is this one sentence in this book, recognizing that our systems, the great thing about these gamification systems, says a gamification creator, is that once people get into it, then you have to continue giving those rewards. And I said, well, why is that? And it's because what we found is that if you take away those rewards at some point, it then damages that intrinsic motivation to do something. If you don't believe me, read this book. This book was second life-changing book, Punished by Rewards, and it is example after example after example of how rewards ruin things, how rewards damage relationships, how rewards discourage risk-taking, how rewards are for that person that says, I just want the C, that's discouraging them to go on because they can get the C, they can get the reward. And that's some of the problems that are going on. This book really changed my thinking about a lot. Here's some specific examples. Deci found that he let adults do puzzles. DC found he let people do puzzles, and he gave people money to do the puzzles. Some people got money, some people didn't get money, and then people that got money didn't want to do puzzles anymore. He looked at kids. He identified kids, or Lepper did some interesting work with kids and magic markers. He looked to see what kids out there are using magic markers and grabbed those kids in. And then some of those kids got rewards for using magic markers, and some didn't. And then he came back a few weeks later and he saw the kids who originally liked magic markers in free art time that got rewarded for using magic markers did not return to magic markers. They were using other things. The kids that didn't get those rewards kept using magic markers. That book has study after study after study talking about how rewards undermine interest, which really makes me get a little worried when I think about summer reading programs designed to teach the love of reading by giving kids cookies to read books. Even he talks about that in this book, that we've got some problems there. So let's return back to our definition of gamification. Games is play plus goal plus structure. If we solve this equation for play, I have a math major, I can do these things. So if we solve this equation for play, then we find out that structure plus goals is equal to games without play. That doesn't sound very fun, does it? Take a game, take away the play, and what you have left are structure and goals. But games without play is exactly what these gamification structures I've been talking about are. It's the structure and the goals to facilitate engagement with the real world. And I think, you know what, we could probably do better. And what if we take the games and we take away the structure and goal, and what's left? Play. And what if we think about how do we use play? How do we engage people with play? How do we help make these tasks more meaningful to people? How do we avoid the external rewards that replace intrinsic motivation? So my goal with meaningful gamification, and at this time a lot of game scholars were poo-pooing gamification, saying that, oh, it's awful. And Ian Bogost wrote an article in the Atlantic called Gamification is Bullshit. And a lot of game scholars just saying gamification is bad. And I was part of that. This is when I was at MIT. And I stopped and I said, you know, rather than just say it's bad, why don't we try to do something better? Why don't we offer a choice? And I know from my library side that you have to use the word gamification if you want people who are searching for gamification to have any chance of finding what you're talking about. If you just say, well, I don't like the word gamification, I'm going to call it gameful design, well, you've lost the whole controlled vocabulary battle. So I think about that, and I said, I'm going to use the term gamification, but I'm going to add meaningful in front of it and begin to really think about that. And this actually comes out of, one of the theories behind this comes out of my library background, where I think about Linda Schomburg and situational relevance, and how we don't know what is relevant for an individual. The only person that knows what is relevant for an individual is the individual. Just like with the gamification systems, we don't know what's motivating or meaningful. Instead, what we have to make is a broad system where people can find their own paths and find what's meaningful. This is the theories behind my meaningful gamification. I'm not going to go into these here, but there is an article at becauseplaymatters.com in the publications that talks through this whole theoretical framework and stitches together. But the results of the theory exploration are these, that we want to, some of the things we want to do to help make gamification meaningful is we want to give the player information. We want to tell them why they're getting what they're getting, not just give them rewards. I'll talk about that in a bit. And put the concept of play back into player. That you want to give the player choices and the ability to share with others the choices that they're making. Let players create their own paths. Now, the goal is to make informed play the reward, and to use external rewards sparingly, if at all. But this is a big one, to put the player's benefits first. Not the company's benefits. We're not doing gamification to help the company make more money. We're doing it to help the participants be deeper engaged in different ways. We're not trying to help the researcher get all their research data. This is a problem I have with many citizen science games, is they're actually not benefiting the player. They're only benefiting the researcher. They're basically, what's interesting is we already have this meta system out there, this point-based, this point-based system that's out there that we use to control behavior. And it's a system that's shared across many games. It's kind of like Mozilla's Open Badges network. But we call this thing money. So there's already this point-based system we have called money, that you give people money to do things. And many instances of gamification are really just trying to get away by changing behavior without giving money, but rather giving these intangible points. if you can take away the gamification system and you can replace it with pizzification or beerification, then you probably haven't thought hard enough. So when does it matter, though? Sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes you don't need to go into this meaningful space. If you're just teaching someone a skill, I'm teaching you how to use a hammer by giving you cookies. At the end of the day, the skill of using the hammer is more useful than getting cookies. So you'll continue to use the hammer. If the person has no intrinsic motivation to begin with, then you're not breaking down intrinsic motivation. So these are times when you may need to turn to rewards. If you're just trying to make short-term changes, if all you want is to have higher sales next quarter, you don't care after that, that's fine. But what we're talking about is how to make long-term changes. So I made a recipe for that. This is my recipe for meaningful gamification. These make up the letters of the word recipe. So we have reflection, exposition, choice, information, play, and engagement. And if you're actually going to be at the at the conference on Saturday, I'm doing a workshop where I'm actually having people build a gamification system using this recipe. The idea is that you think through these as you're creating a gamification system. How can you offer these things to the player? What do I mean by each? Versus play. I've got a second article that I talked about science museums, play-based museums, and how they get people to engage with stuff without rewards. Science museums don't have to give the kids candy to get them to explore science. They create playful spaces. How can we take those concepts of participatory museums and give people spaces where they have a freedom to explore and fail within boundaries? Exposition. How do you create stories that allow this player to be a part of that story? This picture is actually the end of an alternate reality game that was run by the MIT Education Arcade called Vanished, which was in partnership with the Smithsonian. And they got kids to engage with researchers at the Smithsonian throughout about a 6-week period. And as they were telling this story, they changed the story based upon how the kids were engaging and what the kids were hypothesizing about in the forums. So the kids started talking about this artificial intelligence that they thought was in the game. And so the artificial intelligence took on this whole life. So a chunk of this story was actually written by the players. And anyone that's ever played role-playing games, in a role-playing game, one player is playing the role of the storyteller. And the storyteller listens to what the players say. So when a player says, "Oh boy, I hope there's not a dragon in that mountain, that'd be awful," guess what's in the mountain? And so the idea of changing the story to help the players feel like they're more part of it, or letting the players help tell these narratives. I do this in my public speaking class. At the first day, I have the students sign up where they're working for a company. And all semester, everything they do is in that story of you are the communications director for this company. And that's actually how I hold the students to higher standards. The students get to pick what they're passionate about. And then I can say, is that a presentation that Nike would give? No, redo it. I actually have a redo structure in my classes where I allow students to redo things, and I hold them to a professional standard. And that's how I've gotten around the C people, is I push them to say, is this something Microsoft would really put out? No? All right, let's do better. Let's make something so what I've actually used in my classes now is I use a badge structure where you get a badge if you do something at the level that a company would accept, and they can get a gold or silver badge based upon how good it is. Or they get nothing, and they have to redo it until they get a badge. And the badge actually, in my grading space mind, the badge is about a B level. So they work until they do something that a library would accept, and then they redo it. And that has really raised the level of what I get. Because the students know, if they turn in something that you would not see in a corporate environment or in a library, I'm going to give it right back and say, it's not good enough. Improve it to make it something that would be a professional.
How do you know they're at that level?
That's the level I'm expecting.
I mean, how do you know that meets the Nike standard?
Oh.
Below it?
I'm using that actually just as a bar to help the undergrads have a mindset of what I'm looking for. So I point them to, I say, look out, go look at Nike's ad campaigns. Can you make something that is that fits within those ad campaigns? And we talk about the different theories of design and these rules of design and help them apply these rules. But that's what I use as the quick mnemonic for the student to help them think about what level do I expect you to turn in. I expect you to make something that could appear in the New York Times. I expect you to do a presentation that would be what would be presented as a PR speech. But letting the students set their narrative space in which to play is really effective. Choice. This is actually Nike Plus. So Nike Plus, while it uses points and badges and that stuff, it does something really well. It lets you set your own goals. Giving the players the ability to say, I want to run more kilometers. I want to do this. How much am I going to do? You can name the goal, and then it sets this goal that you're working for. So it's a way of letting players pick the goals they're achieving rather than forcing them to do goals that you've set up for them. These goals and badges should be thought of as milestones or signposts to the player-selected goal. So a badge can be a pathway leading toward a goal that the player picked. So they're informational. They're along the way. They help you know what your next step is, but you set the goal. Information. This is a picture of the Toyota Prius, and this is information you get when you're driving the car. And it shows you when power is feeding the battery, when power is feeding the wheels. It shows you these things. The other alternative could be it shows you a tree that gets greener as you drive better. And that's actually more of what we see are these badges and systems that don't give us information. Giving people information help them find more meaning, help them understand what's going on. This was actually very useful to me in Weight Watchers. I did the Weight Watchers system for a while, lost about 50 pounds, I've kept it off, and part of it was that they have this system for understanding the points that food's worth. But if you hack the system and you understand the why, you can then not worry about the points anymore because you understand how does fat, calories, fiber, how do these things balance each other out? How do I read a label and understand what's the more healthy choice? It's because if you get the information that's behind it. Engagement, trying to create ways to get people to engage directly with each other. This is from RIT. They have this program called Just Press Play for all their new undergrads. And what it does is it gets the kids out there and engage with each other and engage with faculty in many different ways. The gamification system is designed to help people engage more deeply and meet people outside of their own degree programs and meet faculty. And the system is really working well, and that's the goal, is to get people to explore the school space, explore the degrees, and explore each other. Not in that way. Reflection. So reflection is about how do you connect the activities that are out there to yourself. I've learned a lot about reflection through my participation with an organization called NASAGA, the North American Simulations and Games Association. NASAGA is mainly corporate training, but it's also educational training games, and they're really big on the concept of reflection, having times where you step back and you reflect upon what you're doing. This was actually Jane McGonigal's game that ran at the New York Public Library. I was a participant in this. I was one of 500 people. We got locked into the NYPL from 8 p.m. until 6 a.m., and during that night we wrote a book. The way it worked is you went around the library, you had a smartphone, you'd find one of 100 tagged objects, you'd observe that object for a while because the phone made you stand there in front of the object for a few minutes, actually looking at it, which I thought was really clever. Then you'd go back to the reading room where they had writing stations set up, and you'd have a challenge, a writing challenge for you based upon the object. You'd write it, you'd think about it, you reflect, you'd write about it, you connect the importance of the object to the importance of your life, and that's what the writing was all coming from. It then went to an editor, it then went to a layout person and printed out, and there was a bookbinder who bound the book, and the book is there now in the NYPL reference room. I'm one of the 500 people that signed it, and so this was a way of getting people to reflect upon what was important in the library. This is a really well-designed activity.
So I'm just thinking, gamification in the context of an academic course, is the gamification something that occurs throughout the entire course in everything you do, or is it selected assignments that you choose to apply gamification to?
You can go with it either way, and you want to think, yeah, what's your...
So the whole semester could be...
Could be gamified, yes. And
Because I would think that would take a lot of design thought for an instructor, time-wise, to construct this.
it's very easy to make a bad gamification system. It's hard to make a good gamification system.
Do you have a template for...
I have a template for a bad one.
designing?
That's what I applied to my gamification class. I said, I'm going to use, there's a book called Designing the Multiplayer Classroom, which is exactly this. It is that level-based system I showed you. It talks about this optional structures. He talks about how he's done it, but he had a game class, a class full of gamers. I had these classes with non-gamers. And that's where I found the problem where it didn't work. When I used these sort of game models with non-gamers, there was a lot of frustration that the students had. And so I think that was part of I think if I had a class of all gamers, it might work great, because the gamers understand these systems. They understand how to work with the systems.
So the principles that you're really sort of promoting at this point are to build meaningful gamification rather than the sort of rewards.
Right. And this can't be, that's the trick, the hard part, why this is hard. This has to be created for your specific situation. You think through your class and think through, how can I offer my students a narrative throughout the class? How could I offer my students more choice? How can I give them more information to understand what is actually going on, why they're getting those grades? How can I offer them failure-safe spaces? The big thing, the things I'm doing this semester that I took away from my experiments, one is a redo structure. I want to create a failure-safe space where I give students difficult assignments that they try and fail and learn from, which is very much what gaming is about. Gaming is about failing and learning through failure. We don't have that in classrooms now. We do not have failure-safe spaces. I try to create failure-safe spaces. The disadvantage is that it makes a lot of grading. I have this conveyor belt of grading of new assignments and redos that every time I go into Blackboard, I've got a new pile of things to look at. That's been the frustration. The students are producing better quality work than I had last semester by a mile, and I haven't yet had evaluations at the end. I'm expecting they'll be good because the students feel positive about trying things. They're not panicked when they turn something in because they know if they did it wrong, they're going to get a chance to fix it.
By having that kind of structure, though, do they turn in things that are of very low quality so that you give them feedback? Because I know that a lot of times my students will come to me and say, I don't know what you want, and I have step 1, step 2, step 3, and it's like, okay, I want to give them enough space so that they're creative and sort of think outside the box and think in ways that I might not even have envisioned the assignment, and they're worried about how can I get the A.
Right. My fear was that was going to happen. What I did to deal with that in my undergrad class, so I have this undergrad required information presentation design class. The way I do the assignments in that is the class before their assignments are due, I have them do a peer presentation. So they're in small groups, they present what they've done to their peers. The peers then help with that first round. They then present it in front of the class. If they do poorly, they then have a chance to redo it. That was huge. Because I was doing peer reviews as students did the presentations, but I said, well, it's too late. They need the feedback before that. Having that presenting in front of the peers fixes that problem because now they have to show it in front of their peers. Very few people have turned in. So in my other class, my graduate library class, where I have that badge structure, I warned them up front. I said, if you turn it would not be appropriate in a library, I will just give it right back to you and point you to some samples. But no one's done that. I've not had to do that at all. And it's because they know if they know an expectation. They know this needs to be at this level that you would turn in the workplace. That's my expectation. And so I've given people more time on assignments. I'm very flexible on that because I'd rather they turn in and work to something good than just turn in crap. I don't want to deal with that.
One of the things I did on the grading, I do very similar models to you to provide an overall narrative and working through failure spaces is doing performance in the classroom. Right. So instead of having all these pieces I have to grade at home, I have them perform it and they get the feedback there. The narrative of the course gets built on we're building up to something big.
Okay.
So it's gonna get and it's like one stage at a time. So years ago I used to teach in Second Life, and what I would have the students do is they would first start out building something really small. Then start with the social builds that would give tours around to learn how to take people around, learn how to manage people. Then 2 weeks later they would do a small group build, so they actually build something together, work as a team, and then once again use those same skills where they're instead of taking people somewhere, they're running people through their build. And then introduce them to the community, then they meet like a real community manager, a real person, then they start working for that person.
That sort of all builds and builds and builds on each other.
Get the intrinsic value, or eventually they're doing
Right.
some kind of fundraising or something for a big group, and they're out publicizing, they're doing TV shows or tweeting their social media campaign, and they're doing this huge big piece towards the end of the semester. And they have these chances all along. And they're not necessarily turning pieces in, but you're using the time that you're in the classroom to have the performance where you can give immediate feedback and they get a kind of test on each other.
Yeah, and the building towards something big helps you avoid the early, here's my failed final project, because they're just building.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if you fail here. You're learning. You're learning all these small things. If you fail here,
And it's making that safe space where they feel like they can try this stuff. That works really well.
But you have to definitely, though, I found that having those sort of presentations in the classroom, you have to kind of schedule them and make them in some ways formalized so that they feel like there's some sort of, there's some weight to it, so that when they come and present, what I've seen is like in the early part of the semester when they come and present, a few of the teams will just completely bomb, but they're squirming and they're like, it's painful for them, and because they're just really like, sort of showing their work to the whole class and being kind of exposed in that way. And so then they work so much more towards the second presentation, which really has been effective. I've had students who have had like them in their second semester where they really performed poorly in the first semester because I didn't have any of this stuff really built in, but this actually current semester, some of those same students who were in my class before felt that kind of pressure in that first presentation, and they have really been working so much more. I've seen like vast improvements in their work this semester. It's been very interesting.
That's where the narrative is so important, because you can role play too as the teacher, which is one of the big things I do throughout. And so when they come for the presentations, I tell them, I'm Donald Trump, and you're coming in to present for my thing. And I set them up as that TV show or as something, and tell them it's all on the line here. and I dress differently. I'll put on my sport coat and I'll come in and just grill them, you know, one day. And they know the role's coming. They know this thing's coming. And they react to it and they perform for it.
Yeah.
Now, these presentations for feedback purposes that might be in stages, are they graded on that, or just the final thing that they submit?
So for mine, in this particular class, each one's got a grade.
Each one?
Yeah.
In the context of what you both
I give
spoke
feedback.
about?
I don't give grades.
I give
You give
some, I give
you
a
only
certain
give feedback. Do you
point
give-
value, a small point value for the presentation.
Over the
but
overall?
I give a, it's project-based learning, so every project has a rubric, and every rubric has multiple categories, and they get points, and the presentation is one category, but the content is another, points is, you know, every day.
And Joe, you wait till, you build to the end?
I build to the end.
Yeah.
So it's feedback?
It's feedback, constant feedback.
Which is
Either
more motivating.
Yeah,
That's,
either way.
I
Yeah.
feel that.
It
That's the
works.
type
Yeah.
of learner I am. So
Yeah.
I teach to myself.
And the research shows that. That's more, that feedback throughout is more motivating than going for that goal. You know, getting the feedback is actually a better way to do that.
Well, you're
So.
getting feedback with your model,
They get
too.
feedback.
You're still
Right,
getting
right.
Qualitative
For
and
the
the
next-
points, 'cause
Yeah. I mean, and you always are giving that. So there's two, I'll talk briefly about two settings to get you thinking about how you apply the recipe. We're going to talk about healthcare, and we're going to talk about libraries. Because these are both situations where people come in with intrinsic motivation to do something, but we're seeing these reward systems that are maybe ruining that. Remember I talked about Zamzi early on? Zamzi was that reward-based system for kids. We're going to reward them for doing exercise. Do you see any potential issues with this? You know, and the research shows us if you reward someone to do something and you ever take away those rewards, then you take away that external motivation, and actually that is harmful to their original intrinsic motivation. The research shows us that people, so if to real world setting, you give the kids rewards now, the problem with this stuff is short-term rewards work and they're easy to implement. So is giving away pizza. That works too. But if you take away those rewards, then the kids are going to be less likely to go and do exercise than they were when they started the whole thing. So in personal health, I talked about early the Nike Plus system, how that's giving people choices of what they engage with. Giving a story, there's an app called Zombies Run that is actually a running game that you go out and start running, and the game engages you in a narrative, and the narrative encourages you to run at different paces when you might not normally run. It's actually teaching you it's using interval training to help you run, but because of the engagement with the narrative, it's a much more engaging activity than, you know, having your typical run keeper yell at you, it's time to hurry up. Creating spaces for play, these ropes courses that you may have seen are really playful spaces that get people out and exercising. Trying to think about this sort of thing as a playful space. Ways to give people more information. I was actually talking with a person at Harvard Medical School about how could you create systems that help you visualize the changes you're making to your body as you do physical therapy. So rather than just tell you go do 10 reps, you're actually seeing your muscles that you're fixing. You're using our visualization tools as they get better to be able to see the impact that these reps are doing to you, to help you visualize, oh, well, this is, now I know why I'm doing this. I can see what it's doing, and people will be more likely to continue it if they've had that information. They've had that feedback. I talked earlier about the Weight Watchers model, that giving people information about why different types of foods are good for them and helping them understand that is something then they'll be more likely to continue instead of just giving them a gold star for eating certain things.
When you see the muscle, you need an X-ray.
Well, so that's the idea. It's when you go to a physical therapy center, as visualization tools get better, that you actually, this is talking about is what this would look like. How could you use systems that would give you visualizations? It might not be an actual visualization of your body, but it might be looking at the different stimulus points and then turning that into a computer simulation. But you're actually, the data is driven by you, kind of like the Prius. You know, you really weren't seeing a picture of the car driving. You were seeing a simulation of the car driving, but the information was coming from the car. Same thing with your body, and we're seeing some of this. We're starting to see some visualization during physical therapy, because it's a real challenge with physical therapy. How do you get people to continue physical therapy at home? And having game-based systems that are not just giving them a gold star for doing 10 push-ups, but are actually helping them see, oh, this is how it's changing my body, can have a bigger, help people have intrinsic motivation to continue this stuff. Reflection and engagement, Weight Watchers uses this in a great way to get people to engage with each other, to reflect with each other, and so thinking about using systems that encourage that rather than just giving points. Talking about libraries, I said earlier about the warning about summer reading programs. Actually, Ruth Small at Syracuse is just finishing a study now where they are documenting the hazards of using rewards in these summer reading programs. Anecdotally, you could just think about what I learned in when I was doing my research on gaming. One of the reasons why the libraries wanted gaming is because the group of people least likely to use libraries are teenagers, which is right after the time they age out of summer reading programs. Huh. So maybe we're actually doing some harm by offering these. If we're trying to inspire a love of reading, we do it through other things. We do it through storytelling. This was the gamification system I showed you earlier. So this is from screenshots you can see that's going, things that are going on, what people are borrowing when people are coming into the library. This is actually data that anyone can get to and see what's going on. Now these people have checked a box somewhere saying, yes, it's okay to, I don't know what the box actually says, but at some point they opted to allow their stuff to be used publicly. But you know, you see these leaderboards, it makes me start to think about, okay, these people might have said it's okay, but what about another library patron who sees this and thinks, are you guys gonna put my content up there? This was actually just a screenshot I took. These are badges that Nicole has earned. So I can see Nicole visited the library on this day. She returned Gender, Power, and Sexuality, so she borrowed it, then she returned it, and she visited the library. And I thought, this is actually setting up a situation to be extremely creepy. To see, oh, I can see Nicole's in the library right now, and she just returned this book on gender, power, and sexuality. I'm gonna go have a talk with her. Even if Nicole said, yes, you can use my stuff in this way, what's the chilling effect this has on other library patrons that see this? And you can see this right now. This is live. You can go and see what people are checking out. And this bothers me a lot with library privacy and all the issues that, now this is a UK system. They actually presented at ALA that last year, and there's different laws about what's going on with privacy, but they're trying to bring it into the US.
I was going to ask that because Andrew Walsh is there. So
Yeah.
is it from Huddersfield?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
What was the audience reaction to that?
Sort of quiet stun, actually. And, it was kind of like a, huh?
Well, Andrew, I had him when I did the Reference Renaissance. I invited him to be the keynote speaker, and he was talking about augmented reality and a lot of this stuff early on.
So he's contracted out with another system to make this. And I talked to the people who were from this system who have nothing with libraries. So this concept of privacy was just nowhere. When I talked to them after that, I said, I need to talk with you guys. This is a real problem. And I don't know what they've done with it since. You can still see the stuff from Huddersfield. There are other ways to do it through things like alternate reality games where you're adding a storylight layer onto a library experience. And this is actually what I'm creating right now, an alternate reality game toolkit for libraries. We're partnered with MIT. The idea is a toolkit that a library can use where they plug in basic information, and then the toolkit gives the library an alternate reality game to help people explore library resources. So this is actually in development now. We'll be testing it this summer and this fall, and we'll be finishing this grant, and we'll see if we get another one to make it bigger. That's the idea. Is we're prototyping it with academic libraries now, and we'll move on from there. But this is one of my current active funded research projects. But you can do narrative play. I created a role-playing game called Cross Paths, which is available and free. It's a role-playing game for libraries to use. I've run it at library events with 400 librarians who didn't know they were going to play a role-playing game until at the end I told them, by the way, you guys just did a role-playing game. It's really an interactive improv game where everyone picks their favorite character from any book and writes up that character, and they pick their favorite setting from a book. And they write down 3 things that happen in the book. And then you have a way of telling the stories where all these characters that people love are together in the world, interacting with each other through these different challenges. And it's a way to engage with your characters, and not just you got a cookie for reading it. It's like you picked out something that was cool and you really engage with the story. You could actually do a whole summer reading program around role-playing, around cosplay, costume play, about teaching kids how to make costumes, how to engage with characters, how to continue the story, how to do writing activities, how to do alternate reality games, and how to do choose your own adventure games. There's great choose your own adventure game tools out there to easily create text-based choose your own adventure games that would be fantastic as a focus in a summer reading program that wouldn't just be about getting rewards.
Have you done meaningful gamification where it isn't an individual thing that I'm just individually striving for? It's more collaborative. We're working together as a group towards this for these purposes.
Well, and that's what, like the Find the Future at the NYPL, was you were actually in small teams. And so a team-based activity works very well for these kind of structures. That's actually the engagement concept, that when you have people working together, they actually can build motivation because they care something about the people they're working with. I'll get to your comment actually in just a few slides, as well as the big next step. So I've used I talked about the participatory museum stuff, using creation activities in libraries, tying this into maker spaces, helping people to make things and create. That's actually coming out of what we're talking about. So the cool thing about libraries is they're great places to have people feel confident about themselves, to have people make their own choices, to have people feel related to the world around them. Libraries are all about self-determination theory. They're great places for this. And so rather than have these library rewards programs where you come in and get 5 books and get a reward, you know, why don't we make libraries the reward? Libraries should be what we're trying to position to say, you know, you do for parents, you do your chores for 5 days, you get to go to the library. That's your reward. You know, rather than make the library, we want to make the library the dessert, not the vegetable. But for the love of God, we don't need to do this.
By the way, your slide said
Dessert. That's why I went past it very quickly. I realized that. I'm like, oh, we'll keep going. You get a gold star. So this is what we don't want to do. We don't want to do this. This is the concern, is that, and this is my concern with some of the gaming in libraries, is some libraries said, we're going to give the kids games as a reward for checking out books, for reading books. And I'm like, no, if we're going to use games in libraries, let's use games because games are a cool form of storytelling, that games are a form of narrative. Games are the interactive way that people are taking in fiction these days. And let's embrace that as the library, not, oh, it's this thing to get them to go check out books. This is where it breaks. This is my concern is, you know, we make chocolate-covered veggies, which is not a good way of mixing vegetables and dessert. So to summarize this stuff, gamification is this adding a game-based layer to the real world, that these rewards can work fine for short-term change, for no intrinsic motivation. If someone doesn't have a desire, the reward can get them started. For building skills, for the initial marketing, rewards, giving away pizza at the first meeting works. Trying to have pizza for every meeting doesn't. Because then if you stop doing the pizza, people will stop showing up. But instead, thinking about meaningful gamification, thinking about reflection and exposition, thinking about choice and play and information and engagement. But then what? This is where I am right now. I have just started working on this book called The Gamification Journey. And my realization is that this is not about reward-based gamification. This is not about meaningful gamification. This is about engaging people in the real world. And how do you use gamification as a journey where the goal is to get people out of the gamification and engaged in communities of practice and engaged in communities of interest? How do you use game elements to get people so they don't go back to the game elements, but now they're in these communities of practice as mentors, as leaders, as creators? If we think about that from the beginning, how do we use gamification to get people to that point where they no longer need the gamification to be involved? That's what I'm writing right now. And this is where my research is. And after I write this up, then I will actually start building these things. But I'm testing it in the classroom. But this is my most recent aha. It's like, it's not about making a system people will stay in forever. That should not be our goal. This is going to upset many gamification people out there who are selling their wares, creating gamification systems, because these reward-based systems are designed to keep you in the system forever. And I say, no, let's make it a journey. The rewards can be used to get people in the door. The meaningful gamification helps them find meaning. And then you help them engage in those communities through these game elements. So you help them find how they could be a leader, how they can be a mentor, how they can be a creator, and how they can be outside of the gamification system. And then they're involved in the real world setting. And that's my push on what we can do with gamification. So to learn more, read Punished by Rewards if you want an educational approach, or Drive if you want a corporate approach to understanding the problems with rewards. BecausePlayMatters.com has articles supporting all this stuff I've talked about. My new article just went up this morning about gamification in the classroom. It's got the cross paths activity. You've got different projects. You can see what we're doing with the Game Lab. Most importantly, ask your local gamers. Gamers know why they play games. Ask them why they play games. Help them create these systems and help them get engaged, because gamers know game mechanisms that are engaging, that are fun. They've been doing games by choice, and get them involved. And that's a great way to build a gamification system.
okay. Awesome, amazing, blown away. But I have two big, what I think are big cookies. So coming out of Syracuse and having been sort of immersed in that environment where self-determination theory is sort of in the water.
Mm-hmm.
We all have sort of experienced Ruth Small's connection to the University of Rochester and DC and Ryan, and I got a chance to meet them in the early 2000s when I was working on some of Ruth's projects and all of that. And so I've also been using self-determination theory in a lot of my work. And my research does support a lot of what you're saying, and I've seen that in Global Aurea, the game design project that I study, that those who have intrinsic motivation, I've linked it to outcomes.
Okay.
And so I've measured intrinsic motivation as a survey variable and looked at their outcomes, and I've been able to connect it positively to positive outcomes. And actually, one of my studies indicates that extrinsic is negatively correlated
Okay.
with outcomes in one of these.
Which is what the theories and other studies
So I
should
appeal
support.
to being a junior faculty powerless person, please let me work.
Send it to me.
I will. And then also, but I wanted to highlight two kind of key thoughts. So
Mhm.
one of them is you have set up an argument towards informal learning, and I want to just make the case for not to totally abandon formal learning environments, because I'm really concerned about, and maybe you've read the Collins to Helgerson book, Rethinking Education in the Digital Era,
Mhm.
and they make a lot of claims about how a move towards informal learning is going to really leave even further behind those who are disadvantaged, because informal learning is, of course, oftentimes only available to those at a cost.
Mhm.
Whereas schools are a very they're not a very equitable environment, but they have the potential to be because they have the reach. And so, in order to meet students who with greater levels of disadvantage, we need to kind of also think about how we can use existing institutions that are already in low-income communities to open these opportunities up to a wider population. That's one critique, and then the second critique I have is you're talking about transformative engagement, and self-determination theory is actually based at its core in psychoanalysis.
Mhm.
DC is a psychoanalyst, and he doesn't actually come out and say this in a lot of his work, but it's clinical. That theory came out of clinical psychotherapeutic contexts, and he thinks about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation from a position of true transformation of the individual, such that you're repairing, deficits that were based in, their early upbringing. And when you're saying that, the narrative of your talk almost says, well, we're just gonna forget about those extrinsically motivated people. We're gonna try to target the intrinsically motivated.
Yeah,
And if you're really talking about transformative engagement, we need to think about transforming those who are extrinsically motivated to being more intrinsically motivated. And I
Mhm.
think that's what you're speaking to, but you don't come out and say that really. And even one of your slides says, you can use rewards for those who are low, who are not. You can use external rewards for those who don't have intrinsic motivation. But in fact, I think that we should be trying to target and design for those who are extrinsically motivated to attempt to move them into more of a creative, open capacity. And so this is what I'm looking at similar work, and I have a new study that I'm going to send to you.
Okay.
I'm really following whether we can actually change dispositions from extrinsic to intrinsic through these types of interventions. And I haven't seen in aggregate in any of my studies a shift from extrinsic to more extrinsic to less extrinsic, because it's important to point out they're two different variables. I have seen shifts from less to more intrinsic, but
Mhm.
In the aggregate, we haven't seen a shift. However, I have a new study that looks at change in frequency of engagement in the game design activity and change in intrinsic motivation. And while we're not seeing it as a pre to post change in the aggregate, when you look at those who have been particularly engaged, we are actually seeing when you look at the actual change variables, we're seeing a relationship between change in engagement and change in motivational orientation.
Okay.
So I'll send you that article, so I wonder if you have any thoughts.
Okay. So on your first comment about focusing on the informal learning settings, that's a choice I've made because when I'm getting into this, there was a speaker at, it was from the MacArthur Foundation at the Digital Media and Learning Conference last year, and she said they see libraries, museums, and other informal learning settings as the test bed for what can go into schools.
Okay.
And that was my aha, that was my click that said,
Yep.
because I was getting so frustrated running into this brick wall, and Donald Brinkman actually from Microsoft Research talked about this problem at GLS last year, and so he showed a picture of the classroom and put a frame around it, a picture frame, and said, you know, what we can do is we can think of what we're doing as framing classroom learning at this time. But part of what we can do is if we think about this is where we test out these methods. And that's sort of what I did with my own classroom experiments. That's sort of I'm testing these things out so then I can present it and say, okay, here's data behind the difference it makes. Here's some things we can test out. And maybe we can then go back into the classroom. So it's not showing the teachers, here's this untested method I've got this, but rather you've tested it out and you've brought it in. That was really my click that said, okay, I'm going to focus here, try to bring it in. On the other comment about, so one of the things that I actually is in the theoretical framework is actually looking at, one of the DC and Ryan's pieces is the model where you have, yes,
Yeah.
so I didn't present it in this talk, but the idea that it's not just extrinsic and intrinsic, it's actually a whole spectrum.
Yeah.
And that's actually where much of my recipe came from,
Yeah.
was this idea of people are here. And so there's 5 levels of how you move through this called interjected regulation. And the idea is that there are things you can do like helping people find communities, helping people find reasons why that you appeal to their ego, you know, and there's different levels that can help move people from a purely external reward space to something that is more internalized. And so that's actually in the theory behind this. And in the book I'm writing, that segue is a critical part. How do you take people from that reward structure and segue them into the meaningful gamification spaces, and then how do you take that meaningful gamification space and segue them into communities of practice and communities of interest? So that is actually part of what I'm putting together right now. That's a key part, though, because otherwise, if you don't, you've just got this reward cycle that some people will be happy to show up for the free pizza, and that's fine. But how do you then get to those people? And that's that interjected regulation is actually what I'm looking at for that, is how do you move people along those steps and help them engage? And the problem is it's not one solution for everyone. And this is where we use situational relevance, that you have to provide a set of choices. You have to provide, this is universal design for learning is another theory that I use, where you recognize that people learn and engage with the world in different ways, and you have to give them the ability to make choices as to how they want to engage with their learning. And so those models are really, in these gamification systems I'm putting together, creating those systems that give people choices and helping people become the creators. So you get to craft your own gamification system out of all these tools to help you find what's meaningful to you. So those are some of the tools that I'm building. But that's actually a key part of that book is sort of the short term, the segue, the meaningful, the segue, community membership.
What the gender difference when people play the game or when you design the game for different genders?
I haven't looked at that at all. Part of that's because the approach I'm taking, I'm moving, and that's if you give people the choices rather than dictate to them what they must do, then they could do whatever choice based upon their own, whatever gender might drive them to do something. What would be an interesting thing to explore is to see what do men pick, what paths do men create for themselves, what paths do women create for themselves. That would be an interesting to look at. I've not looked at it at all because it's not something I've considered. I've just been trying to create the broad enough system so everyone can find their way. But that would be, you could actually do that with some of like the Nike Plus system, to say if you hooked gender into goals and the goals people set for themselves, are there patterns between what males and what females set for themselves? But that's where it's really important to make a system and not just a path.
Yeah, I was asking because I was thinking about in a health situation, a lot of times you're thinking about for women in health.
Mm-hmm.
And those kind of games and what are the specific elements you have to think about when you talk about kind of design the game. I definitely think there were literatures that talking about the gender difference
Mm-hmm.
in the game.
Yeah.
Design everything. I'm just not
And there's certainly gender differences in what types of games players prefer. But my argument is that we don't design a game, we don't design just one path, that it's a space like a museum. You know, if you think about a science museum, it's not designed with one path that you take to the museum. But there's actually, so one of my articles is about using concepts of play and participatory museums for gamification design. And it's that concept of let's think about a museum space, a space where you get to explore, a space you create your own paths. And that's really the spaces we're making.
So a lot of what you're talking about with choices and things like that remind me of Constance Steinkuhler is starting to move into this interest-driven learning kind of idea. Does her work in that area inform what you're doing? Because it seems like it's really very much aligned with what you're talking about and trying to use interest-driven learning as a way to keep people, like young boys who are dropping out of school, as a way to keep them engaged in the school system so that they don't drop out, that they actually complete
It will. That's, as I said, the piece that I'm writing now is that's a great thing to bring into that, and that's really my next thing I'm writing on, is that next piece of theory, and what else is out there to help people get, because I think that's this idea of the goal is getting people engaged in communities at the end as a replacement for those game systems. That's got to be driven by interest. It's got to be driven by engagement, helping you tie in what you already are interested in into the real world setting.
And Jamu, when we were looking at sort of building kind of a gamification system at Milwaukee, one thing that we were noticing is that leaderboards, for example, were very discouraging for female students. And the males just really were very into that, wanted to score higher.
Although
So-
2 out of the 3 top lines on mine were female students.
Yeah, so it's interesting to see if as people use that more, if that will change.
Yeah.
But at that time.
There's one stuff I thought was collaborative play versus competition was highly favored among the stuff I was doing.
Yeah, that's why when I talk about gaming in libraries, I encourage libraries, if they're going to do a game program, they do both open play and competitive play. And so people can choose, because they found that boys tend to be drawn to the competitive play and girls tend to be drawn to more of the open play. And so not only making sure you have both available is really important.
Yeah, we had at DML this year, I was presenting a little case about a teacher that we had in the Little Glory project who had noticed that exact phenomenon happening, where, the top students, of course, were motivated by the idea of winning a game design competition, but then the lower performing students knew that they would never be able to reach that, and so they just kind of gave up. And she found that in previous years. So this year what she did was, this is a teacher in East Austin, and she, in a low-income neighborhood community and in a charter school, and she basically contacted like every nonprofit in the city, and so, I think she contacted 30, and 20 responded. She asked them whether they would be interested in having her students create a game that they kind of led the students to develop the content around, and so thematically, like what the game would be about. And so it was super high interest for the community organizations. They were totally into it. They loved the idea, and they were going to get, a kid created game that they could post on their website and say that they were doing more sort of community engagement. And then the kids felt this level. And there's Schaefer talks about epistemic learning opportunities and role taking, and they were able to connect it to this sort of professional goal and working with the community. Like they loved the idea of, or they loved the experience of having the community organizations be in contact with them and exchanging emails. And it made it feel very official. It made them feel like little mini adults, little mini professionals actually doing this work. And so that speaks to, I think, in some ways, also the case that you presented supports that. I think, and it wasn't necessarily, those were more what Renninger will call like situational interests.
Mhm.
They're not necessarily like causes that the students already had an interest in or a long-standing identification with, but some of them were like pet organizations,
Okay.
or like animal rights organizations, things like that, and they had pets, and so they could identify with that. But yeah, like it's that sort of, there's another continuum of interest development where you have the situational versus individual interest.
Mhm.
That's another dimension.
Yeah, the contextual relevance concept, where the context of the situation in which the gamification takes place actually changes everything. Okay.
One more,
Okay,
Dan gets some final.
all right, so first, great context, Scott. I just, for the first time, think I understand a lot. And then when Rebecca brought up the intrinsic and the extrinsic, it got me really thinking. Our society expects that it's good for young kids to be in the education system. And it's good because it produces better citizens, more intelligent voters, people who understand public policy. It's good because it creates a unification of the culture, and it's good because it expands the economy. So then when we looked at certain areas, as you know, I play in a lot of university politics, math professors tell me that students have to have a hard course in calculus, not a calculus appreciation. People in biomedical engineering, people doing artificial limbs say if their students don't have organic chemistry and calculus, they can't function. And those subjects are hard. Those subjects have definite things people have to learn. So we have a mindset in our society that thinks of education whether it's at high school, college, or beyond, as having very specific, concrete benchmarks that people have to adhere to. And then we have you saying, well, there's different types of motivation, and Rebecca saying there's different types of ways people become intrinsically motivated to be creative. And so, to me, at my age, I see a conflict in the end goal where it's going to be difficult for my generation to understand this new model, because the new model is opposite to what I went through in the Army. If a guy couldn't fire the rifle, couldn't do the grenade, couldn't do the push-ups, we didn't want him, because he jeopardized our life. We had very specific things. I was an officer, we wanted the soldiers to be able to do. So how do you get this? And I don't know if the mindset is generational, because I meet young faculty who believe the same as the old faculty, that people have to meet certain things. They have to do it a certain way, basically the way they learned. And so how do you reconcile that? Because you've got totally different worlds here in terms of the end goal.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to talk about, I mean, so there are scholars who, actually, Stiegler, have you seen any of
Mhm.
his? He was just here at Rutgers.
Okay.
And he's a philosopher, and he speaks directly to this. It's really a clash of civilizations. And people are, Ashed and Aviram are other scholars who are calling for a larger cultural conversation around prioritizing what we think should be learned, questioning the core canon, questioning, a revisitation of, as a society, what our values are. I mean, because, you're kind of speaking to the idea that, okay, well, do we really need all high school students to learn chemistry? Or, like, because we've prioritized these functional domains that are what we think are important for people to learn.
And we've based these structures. So we talk about badges and this, all this push from Mozilla and the education space. Oh, badges are going to unlock everything when we have these badge systems. We could have this universal badge system where people have shared badges and you understand what all the badges mean. You have this place where you show your badges. And we've already got this thing, and the badges are called A, B, C, D, and F. We already have badges that we assign to learning. Where this began to break down was really when we industrialized education. When it went away from a space where you learned what you needed to learn to do a job, and you explored that and you figured that out, and then created these factories, these learning factories, and that's where it's kind of, there's a push back to a space of not everyone needs to go through the factory and go through these things, that sort of trade-based concept, helping people to explore trades and explore concepts. I see your eyebrows going up.
Yeah, I mean, and there's something about, like, conditioning versus education. And I think in some ways, our education system does demotivate, and we see this happen in, like, I think third graders, like,
Yeah.
all of a sudden their kids are all sort of, have this desire to learn, and then at third grade or whatever grade it is, the drive drops out, and it's after they've experienced a couple of years of the traditional schooling, and it's creating.
It's hard to make, it's really hard for me, in my classes, it's hard to get the students to believe that I'm offering them a failure-safe space. Because for so long they've been trained on high-stakes classes. And trying to get them to actually accept that, yeah, no, really, you can try and completely blow it. I want to see that. That's just fine. And we'll help you improve. That's what we want. And it's hard. It's a hard shift, especially in every other class there. What do I have to do to get the C? And it's a challenge. And this is why my focus has been more on informal learning spaces.